I think what's important to understand about this was that from the very beginning, when Jesus was proclaimed the Messiah by St. Paul and other figures, what that meant most obviously to the Jews who were his followers, and at the beginning, of course, they were all Jews. Then quite soon, they were more than that. They were people who were Greeks and members of other nations. The people who followed Jesus, when they said that he was the Messiah, they understood that this meant that he was the person whose coming had been predicted by the prophets, in particular Isaiah, who has the most vivid and important predictions in some ways. His coming meant that the promises that God had made to Israel and also to all the nations would be fulfilled. The world of the great empires that had dominated world society since the time of the Assyrians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, that world was coming to an end, and that a different kind of empire, an entirely different kind of empire would be inaugurated. It would be announced by and led by the Messiah, who would then turn the control of it over to his Father, over to God. That world would be characterized by simply by being, shall I say, achieving a level of justice and a level of personal fulfillment for people individually, but a level of social fulfillment, a level of justice and peace that the prophets had described and that Jews had been expecting for several hundred years, even before Jesus appeared. There was a very rich apocalyptic literature, if you particularly look at the book of Daniel, but many other books as well, carrying out the predictions of the prophets, that there was going to be a great transformation, a great change. And this change, by the way, would not mean that time would stop. It wouldn't mean that some kind of science fiction world, would appear where all the laws of nature would be reversed and that sort of thing. It was a continuation of the world that we know, but radically better, radically changed. I mean, so radically that sin and death would be conquered. So that prophetic dream, if you like, was what people thought of when they said the Messiah is coming, the Messiah is here. That means this world is now about to become radically better. And the notion that the Messiah would be himself God was almost immediately controverted by a large number of Christians, and particularly the Christians who tended to live in the East, live in Palestine or live in Syria, live in the great centers of Antioch and Alexandria, the Greek-speaking world. They believed that they still felt connected with their Jewish past, and in some ways even with other aspects of the past of that civilization. And they did not believe that it made sense to talk about Jesus the Son and Jesus the Father being the same, being the same entity. That they were both divine, yes, but that they were identical or equal in stature, no. This view then was challenged in the beginning in the 320s of the modern era. This view was challenged by Christians, many of whom lived in the West, in Western Europe, and the most important figures lived in Alexandria, Egypt. It was challenged by people who were saying, no, if Jesus is divine, he must be God himself. People who lived in the East were the heirs to a tradition in which in some ways was intensely optimistic, which believed that with the great transformation that was about to occur in society, but also in people's hearts, that Jesus served them as a model, that they could imitate him, that they could, even though they might not be sinless, they could get a lot closer to that ideal, and that they could live living a Christian life would mean living a life radically different from the kind that they had lived before under the old empires, the power-worshipping, violence-worshipping empires. They tended to view Jesus as a beloved brother, not a man like every other man, not simply a particularly a spiritually talented guy. More than that. But still close enough to humanity to serve as a kind of for a radical moral improvement of people. The opposition, which was led by Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, the people who wanted Jesus basically to be God himself, were more in the position of saying, particularly as time went on, this became clearer and clearer. They were more in the position of saying, we need a God who fulfill the messianic role, but he'll also be our judge. We are sinners. We can't really aspire to be a lot like Jesus. What we need is a church to protect us, to learn to live with the likelihood that society is not going to get much better than it is now, and that only a few of us who may become monks or adepts, holy people, saints, adepts, super holy, but most of us are not going to make that. This more pessimistic view of the potential of people to develop morally and the potential of society to develop into a more peaceful and just place, that kind of pessimism gets reflected in saying let's have Jesus be in heaven and not be elder brother who is going to help us live a new kind of life.
So tell me about that distinction there, that sort of conflict with the Jewish view of the Messiah and what we now have, where this Jesus is now the second person of the Trinity. What did that do to that view you were talking about from the prophets of the Old Testament, the Isaiah view of peace on earth and all this being brought through that figure, that Mashiach, that anointed one of Yahweh of the Old Testament?
In ancient days, and for a long time, and in some ways in modern days as well, there was not so much of a clear distinction between the divine and the human. There's the writer Karen Armstrong has talked really beautifully about this, that people could be closer or farther from God, and people could contain in their own personalities and their own lives, their own spiritual development, more or less of God. That it was never a question of saying, well, he's so and so is so holy, he must be God himself. People would not say that, because at least in a monotheist culture, that would be an impossibility. To say that, if you say that somebody is not God, that doesn't mean that they don't have a certain measure and maybe a very great measure of divinity. So that that's clear from the Old Testament to begin with. When Elijah dies, God takes him up to heaven because of his special relationship he had a special relationship with God. Jeremiah says, God called me to be his prophet in the womb when I was not even born. A kind of pre-existent idea, If a Jew, say a follower of Paul or one of the other apostles in the early days of Christianity, says, I believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, it means a couple of things. One, as I said before, it means that the new age has begun. It also means that he is going to be in a special way God's representative, that the Davidic Messiah was going to be the liberator of Israel, and also the person that would inaugurate the kingdom of God and bring the truth of that kingdom to the nations. So there's a high degree of, shall I say, there are some people that have special relationships with God in the Old Testament as well. It would not be shocking, in particular, to a Jew of Jesus's generation, if somebody said, well, he's the Messiah and the new age has begun. The answer might be, well, I don't think somebody might say, well, I don't think he is. Or I have reasons to, my interests don't lie in allowing myself to think that he is. But it would not be heretical to be, from a Jewish point of view, it might be a mistake to think that he was the Messiah, but it wouldn't be a heresy to think that he was the Messiah, because, among other things, you're not saying that he's God on earth. You're saying that he's God's representative.
That's what the title Messiah, very Jewish, Mashiach, means or meant. But now, as you know, visiting churches, when you talk about your book, now it seems that that those Jewish Christian titles of Messiah and Son of God in particular, from our perspective, it sounds like they have been redefined to mean something else. When people talk about, Christians talk about Son of God, they really mean God the Son. When they talk about Messiah, they actually mean Yahweh or Jehovah in the flesh. What do you make of that sort of redefinition of what the whole issue was about with these countless councils and debating of the early church you have studied?
I keep thinking this is a tragic result because one of the things that it does is that it splits Judaism and Christianity, and also Islam and Christianity. It splits them in a way that's much more profound than anything else that had happened, and much more profound than it needed to be. For example, among some Jews that I know, that I talk with about these things, for a long time, because of the persecution of Jews in Europe, in particular, if you talk to Jews about Jesus, they don't want to hear about it. Most of them say, "No, that's too much. He made too much trouble for us. His people made too much trouble for us. That we can't. We don't even want to talk about that." But that has really changed in some ways. The idea that Jesus was, at the very least, a great prophet, and maybe more than that, is not something today that will shock Jews the way it did when I was young. Or the Jews of my parents' generation who were just, managed coming out of World War II. That's not a kind of argument that interested them at that point. But today, there's more and more of a tendency to talk about. One of the rabbis has written a book called "Jesus, My Brother," which is a whole different, mindset, and something that might have happened a lot earlier had it not been for this sort of, in some ways, a kind of strange development in which the same Christian faith that kind of takes over the Roman Empire converts itself into a religion that in some ways is a new religion. That is a religion in which God isn't unitary anymore. He's Trinity. He's a composite. The idea that somebody had said, I forget who said, that the problem with the Trinitarian doctrine was not so much that Jesus became God, as that God became Jesus. That it altered the definition of God to the point that now somebody who is a Jew, or at least a non-Trinitarian Christian, would say, this doesn't feel right to me at all. That's not the God that we started to worship, that we learned to worship. Meaning no disrespect to Jesus, or not to lower him below the status of a uniquely holy person.